Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Suman, your host for today, and I have with me my colleague Shambhavi. Hi, Shambhavi.
Hi, Suman. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So the last week has been very eventful for both biotech and science policy, both at the courts and in the budget announcements. On the court side, the Supreme Court has given a split verdict on the GM mustard issue. And equally perplexing or equally on the other side, the budget for this year, while we have been talking a lot, while there's been a lot of noise around long-term capital gains, indexation, etc., what has gotten lost in all this is the announcement in the budget about natural farming. Okay, to discuss both these connected issues, we are here. And in this episode, we hope to lay down what could be possible ways forward for food security in India. So, firstly, the split verdict of the Supreme Court. Shambhavi, can you give us a kind of a broad overview of the whole issue?
Sure. So, GM mustard has been around for decades now. This is a variety that was made by a professor at Delhi University. The technology by itself is foreign, it's not Indian, because the patent is owned by a foreign company. But this particular variety was made in India using Indian parent plants as well. So they have been seeking approval for its commercial release for over a decade. It was approved by the government's committee. Following that, there was a petition in the court to stay its commercialization. This is not the first time that there have been petitions in the court to prevent commercialization of GM food crops. This is the second one, in fact, after BT brinjal. And again, very similar to what happened with the BT brinjal. Government first passed it, then had to stop it. The court gave a split verdict, which means that one judge agreed to the decision to commercialize, one judge did not. And so they've referred it to a higher bench of judges. So we basically have to wait longer to understand whether GM mustard is ever going to see the light of day or not. But the judgment itself is very interesting. Now, GM technology is not new. It's over 30 years old. The first GM crop, tomato, was approved 30 years ago in 1994. Yet the judge that disagreed with releasing GM crops has called this as the emerging technology, which I think this goes to show somehow that we have not been able to inform the judiciary enough on the advancements in technologies, right? There are no ways GM is an emerging tech. In India, yes, we don't have a lot of GM crops, but I assume that has happened because we have not approved of any GM crops apart from BT cotton, which is not a food crop. If we had approved of them, we would have seen probably a more vibrant industry, more R&D, more efforts going to be made to create GM crops, right? We did not allow BT brinjal. If we do not allow GM mustard, I don't see why any third company will ever put money down to creating another GM crop, right? So it's always going to remain this emerging tech market then. And this is really weird because a lot of the GM oil that we consume, for example, is genetically modified. So it is not that we are not getting in food which is genetically modified, it is. And that's simply because a lot of the world's corn and soya bean is genetically modified crops now. So it is quite interesting. I think in one of the previous petitions against GM mustard itself, the court had observed that there is no compelling case for use GM mustard because we don't have a shortfall of GM of oil seeds. Um, But this is very problematic because you can't wait for there to be a compelling case. A compelling case in this case would be gross insufficiency of food. You can't wait till that to happen to then say that, okay, we're now going to test an emerging technology and see whether that works or not, right?
True, true. Yeah.
Then we don't have time. So we'll have to do it do it now. We already do import a lot of oil seeds. So it's not that we are completely self sufficient and this is a completely trial technology that we do not need to kind of experiment with right now. Um, None of that is true. So I don't really see the case against GM crops itself. The government could have done it better. I agree with the court's judgment on that. We
Yeah.
should have better regulatory mechanisms. We should have been more transparent with data. This is something that we have argued for a long time. When it comes to genetically modified crops, make publicly available the data on safety. I don't know why that is not being done because then that makes you suspicious. And I agree with that, that we just need to have better regulatory systems, more transparent systems, and those should take care of a lot of the public concerns.
Yeah. Also, I mean, with respect to this particular issue itself, I was reading that even the way this approval was given was not made. I mean, was not put up on websites, was not given, public consultations, etc. Of course, the center is arguing that nowhere in the world that these kind of things will be on any kind of web portal or whatever. But I guess even making available or making transparent the way that you have gone around giving the approval would have helped the cause a little more.
It would have, and I just to that point actually of other governments not making them available. I think there is. I mean, I don't know about GM itself, but look at COVID vaccines, right? When COVID vaccines were approved, especially in a very trialing conditions, right? The US FDA made all of the meeting minutes publicly available. All of the data that they saw, everybody saw. And everybody could see how they concluded that Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were going to be approved. We did not do that, right? We should have. Yeah, so they made all of these findings known, right? The US FDA with regards to COVID vaccines. And we need to do these kind of things to build public trust in emerging technologies, without which there won't be, right? If we keep them hidden, there's no point. Ask questions on why people are not believing us. The second is that you expect the company to do the testing and tell you that it is whether it works or not. We, I think, inherently don't trust private sector so much. So when a private company tells you that please take my product, it is safe. Yeah, that is unlikely to happen. It is better that one of the government institutes does some amount of testing to show safety. On the flip side, obviously, people keep on saying that, and even the court said that, oh, we need long term studies. But what does long term mean? There has to be some kind of reasonable understanding of what is acceptable in the long term.
What is
And yeah,
you define the period, right?
yeah. And then you go ahead and you can do those kind of studies. So we don't have that clarity on policy. There was a lot of talk in the judgment about the current rules on genetically modified crops being violating Article 21 and being unconstitutional because they impact environment and biodiversity. But that I don't really buy. I mean, agriculture by itself impacts biodiversity. I mean, if whenever humanity decided to domesticate plants many, many centuries ago, if all of the anti-GMO lobby was there, they would have probably been anti-agricultural lobby as well, saying that we are going to destroy biodiversity and everything, so we shouldn't do that. Uh, and they would have been right. I mean, we did. I mean, we did. We have to live with the choices that we made. And the truth that we have to live with right now is that we have accelerated climate change to an extent that natural evolution will not be able to keep pace with the rate of change in climate, which means that species will die out unless we can provide them external help, which means for future generations, if we want to ensure that there is food security, they will need to have the tools, if they require, to be able to create novel plants that can adapt to the climates that they will see. And gene editing and gene modifications are tools and technologies which would allow them to do that. And therefore, we have to be experts at those.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, Shambhavi. Thanks for that perspective. Now, the court has asked for a national policy to be formulated. Is that right?
That is right.
Yeah, the policy should be formulated in consultation with all stakeholders, and all of that. So, what do you think this national policy will look like, or what
Right.
should it look like?
So I should have clarified this before. This was a two-judge panel, obviously.
Yeah.
The points that I've mentioned so far were by one judge, but both judges agreed that we need a national policy. What we have currently is a law, and this law kind of governs genetically modified crops and their deployment in India. We don't have a vision document. I guess this is what the court is also asking on the utility of GM crops in the Indian ecosystem, how they can be best used so that we do not tamper with nature more than that is necessary, and how can we best, I guess, educate farmers, etc. I think a policy needs to talk about a lot of these things. When BT cotton first came around, BT cotton is by far is the only GM crop allowed in India, has been fairly successful in its adoption by Indian farmers, and has definitely increased cotton yields. When it came with this advisory of 80-20 use, as in if a farmer was using GM BT cotton, they would use BT cotton in 80% of their field, and 20% of the field would be normal cotton. Now, BT cotton obviously has this gene that makes it resistant to bollworms, right? Which is a common pest of cotton. The idea is that 20% cotton which will not be resistant, the bollworms will feed on that. So the bollworm population to a certain extent would live on. We won't be putting an evolutionary pressure on them to survive, and the farmer would get increased yield from the remaining 80% of the field, right? This was a very scientific way of looking at the use of GM crops, because if you put 100% of your field as genetically modified cotton, that means that the bollworm has to develop resistance to that gene that causes his death to survive, right? And that means that we have now seen bollworms evolve, which is evolution, right? This is nothing against the technology, right? You could have created the same plant which is resistant to bollworms using various different means. The bollworm would have developed resistance. This is just how evolution works, right? There's nothing against the GM technology itself. So what we see is that the bollworm evolved. We were not able to predict or forecast it beforehand, and we there was failure of the crop. This is not really failure of the technology. We say BT cotton failed, but no, it was failure of us to understand that this is how evolution will work and this is what will happen. So the problem is also that we have very small marginal holdings in India, right? We can't expect this 80-20 to work to similar ways it has worked elsewhere where people have hold large agricultural lands. We could have thought of other ways of getting this done. But a national policy needs to understand this and figure this out as to how we can appropriately use GM technology in small marginal holdings where farmers have agencies, where they do talk to each other, where we are not treating farmers as if they are beholden to some foreign company and they will do as told. How do we circumvent that social ecosystem to help them make their best choices? And how do we boost research within India so that the GM crops that we make are relevant to our future use? I think a national policy has to address all of those concerns.
Yeah, that's great. Uh, Talking about national policy, do we want to talk about the next thing that we have, or do we have something else on BT itself that we want to cover?
Just on the no, not specific BT itself, but on GM mustard itself, I do want to make one point. Um, there's a lot of talk about herbicide resistance and the fact that herbicide resistant plants are not good. They will cause deterioration of the soil because farmers will use too much herbicides. They will cause women farmers to lose their jobs because women are primary weed pickers, and they won't have any jobs because the herbicides will do that job instead. GM mustard was made using the herbicide thing as a characteristic to pick out the plant with the biggest yield. It is not a feature required by farmers to use So if farmers choose to use that as a variant going forward, it is a farmer's choice, right? It is not necessary to get higher yields. It has already done its function for higher yields. The plant is already higher yielding without the requirement of a herbicide. So I wanted to make that clarification because we often see this as a problem when it comes to GM mustard.
Yeah, I think even the activists in this case had actually said that this could lead to herbicide resistant superweeds, right? So yeah,
Yes.
this
If
yeah.
herbicides are used, but the plant actually doesn't require it for the yielding purposes.
Okay. Okay. Now, that is a nuance that gets missed out very often, I'm sure, in this, and it helps that somebody like you is giving that explanation. Yeah. Thanks so much. And yeah, talking about policy itself, the other development that has happened in the last week or so is that about natural farming. So there's so much talk about natural farming, organic farming, whatever different ways we classify this different kind of food that we eat. Right? So what is the case for natural farming? Is there a good case for it? Why should we do it? And given that the budget has, specified that in the next 2 years, a few crores of farmers across the country will be initiated into natural farming. What is the rationale behind it?
Right. So I think if you think about it, natural farming is also a scientific way of farming. It is just that it might not be very technology oriented, and therefore people might think that this is not science, because we think of science to be cutting edge. But ecology is also a part of the life sciences. So natural farming, making not using chemicals, trying to maintain soil health, etc., is also a form of science and should be practiced, should be recognized as well as we do genetic engineering. I don't think we should value judge either of them. It has obviously its pluses in maintaining long term health. Just if we can ensure that our current climate change crisis does not impact the way natural farming is done, or whether we already have not seen enough deterioration that can push us into natural farmers into losing yields. There are prevalent practices within agriculture, for example, farmers save seed, etc., that can lead to the deterioration of seed quality. We have to ensure that things like that don't happen when we push for natural farming. But I think there is merit to trialing various ways of agriculture. I don't think there's one set way. I think one of the issues that we see come up again and again is looking at either gene editing or gene modification as a
The
dramatic, yeah, is either going to just solve for our food security problem, or it is going to kill biodiversity completely. And natural farming is either going to help us completely, is the only way for agriculture, or it is going to lead us to Sri Lanka way, where we become debt ridden and have to depend on foreign countries for sustenance. I don't think it's true of either, right? So it's not. We have to consider that there is so much variations happening in the climate right now. We are such a vast country. We have such huge food security concerns that we can't think we can just close our eyes and rely on any one thing. We have to keep all of our weapons in our arsenal. We have to make sure that we have enough expertise to, if you want to do natural farming, for those farmers who want to do natural farmings, have enough access to the correct information on rain, on soil health, etc., to follow those, access to capital to buy seeds, etc. Those who want to do genetically modified crops have enough access to understanding what kind of GM crops are available, how to use that technology correctly, how to make sure that resistance does not happen in if it's a pest resistant variety, for example, how to protect, how to monitor for environmental impacts if those happen, how to look for soil health again if you're using a herbicide resistant variety and using a herbicide, right? Or if you're using pesticides. So all of those I think are going to be very important and will come down to this: how well do we understand the science behind both the techniques, and how well can we educate our farmers to use the science?
Yeah, is it then right to say that natural farming requires more localized knowledge, localized thing? And if you're looking for scale or something bigger, then we should look at like GM or whatever. Is that one way of looking at it? Because natural farming, I think, will depend a lot on local conditions, right? What works in one place may not work in the other. So, can we even talk of the two together?
I think as a government, they can obviously allow both, encourage both, and make sure that the conditions are right for both. For a farmer who chooses either or to be able to experiment. I don't think we can think about what works at the small scale and what works at
Yeah,
a large scale, because these are very different ideologies as well of agriculture. So I think it's best left to the farmer. I don't see why we should make that choice for them. We can obviously institute, I think, best practices,
sure.
but I think we should not impose either or. We should definitely not try to discourage either or methods, because, as I said, I think we need all sorts of agricultural interventions, because some might work, some might not, or there'll be times when some work, some might not. We should be able to help our farmers, the ones who succeed and the ones who fail both. Because as a country, what we need is the agricultural outputs, and that is what we should really be focused on.
Yeah, sure. That gives a good overall view on the whole thing. Are there some closing comments you want to make on either of the two issues, and then we can close this episode?
I think my closing comment is I think we overthink a lot of aspects of agriculture. Agriculture is way too complicated, anyways, and I don't see why we need to pit one form of science against another form of science by judging them. There has been plenty of evidence to show that GM crops are safe, for example. And there have been plenty of national case studies now that show that countries which have chosen to do natural farming only had issues with
Yeah,
meeting their
food security.
domestic food requirements, and have
Yeah,
then had to divert back to GM crops.
yeah. We don't want to be at least
Yeah,
left
we
in
don't
the
want to be in that
yeah,
situation. We have to be pragmatic. And I think as the government, the role has to be make informed choices available for farmers.
sure. Thanks, Shambhavi. I'm sure we'll hear more on both these issues, on the GM mustard issue as well as on natural farming. So there's a lot to talk and a lot to unpack in the coming weeks or so. So we'll see you again, and we hope the listeners will tune in back for updates on this. Thank you all for
Thank you,
listening.
Manisha. Thank you for listening.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.